Good evening. I'm Dr. John Riley, and welcome back to episode 3 of the Civil War on Paper, in which we are reading the Schenectady Democrat and Reflector for August 8th, 1861. And in this week, we have speculation about the shape of the Confederate government and its leaders. We have news from the war and the home front, and we have a bit of local heat as the city of Schenectady catches fire. So let's get in to some of this week's headlines. First, candidate for president of the rebel states. The Augusta Chronicle expects very soon to see two parties arrayed in the new Confederacy, struggling for the presidency next fall, and the division, it thinks, will be upon the point of admitting other states. One favoring the admission of other states, which may choose to accept our Constitution, in this case, the slave constitution of the Confederacy, the other clinging to the delusion of a pure slavocracy. The present provisional president and vice president, that would be Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, both, quote, favored the idea of ultimate reorganization, while Howell Cobb, it is implied, and the ultra-Southern party are forever opposed to the admission of free states. Here, then, says the Chronicle, is the program as we think. Howell Cobb for president, upon the basis of an admission of any free state, and no admission of such slave states as will give the power in the Confederacy to admit free states by a two-thirds vote. In this wise, as we take it, is a party to be organized in opposition to the present administration. So what this is referring to is the fact that the Confederacy is still shaping its national government on the fly as the war is happening at this point. Jefferson Davis had been nominated to lead the Confederacy in February 1861 when the Provisional Congress met in Montgomery, Alabama. This Congress had formal representatives from only 7 states, as at that time, several states that would later join the Confederacy had not committed to doing so. Notably Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, and Arkansas. However, these states, as well as Kentucky and Missouri, did send secessionist-minded delegates who observed. Now, Davis seemed a reliable choice for a wartime leader. He had been educated at West Point, he had served in war against both Native Americans and Mexico, and had served in the Pierce administration as Secretary of War. However, a formal popular vote would not be made until the fall of 1861. What the Augusta Chronicle is speculating here, and what's being reprinted in the Schenectady Democrat, is whether he will face opposition from Howell Cobb, who had been a favorite of President Buchanan's and was the acting president of the Provisional Congress. Cobb had been the Treasury Secretary, but had resigned following Lincoln's election. Now, ultimately, Davis and Alexander Stephens, the provisional vice president of the Confederacy, who is perhaps most famous for saying the obvious part out loud, that the new Confederacy's cornerstone rested on their unshaken belief that blacks would never be the equal of whites, ran unopposed. When there's only one candidate, there's only one choice. And the Southern election of 1861 was mostly just a rubber stamping of the choice that had been made for Southerners in Congress in February. Now, this issue in question, what he's talking about here about admission of other states, did cause some issues in the Provisional Congress, as members of the Georgia and South Carolina faction, two of the states with the greatest density of enslaved people, wanted to exclude the possibility of free states ever joining the Confederacy. It was Howell Cobb's brother who was one of the loudest voices for this. Free Confederate states would represent a bizarre contradiction, a paradox that would reintroduce all of the domestic strife that Southern secessionists were seeking to escape by creating their own country, where slavery could be paramount and protected in perpetuity. Eventually, a compromise was achieved whereby new states could be added by two-thirds majority of the existing states, thereby ensuring that any new lands added to the Confederacy, and they did have plans to add new lands, would promote and protect slavery as an institution. and Southern leaders at this time have been quite vocal about their desire to continue adding land, not just from Mexico, but also Cuba, Latin America, other places in the Caribbean. Southern writers had been talking about this for decades at this point, and it was widely speculated that had the Confederacy succeeded in breaking away, it would have had zero qualms about aggressively expanding its territory, as slavery itself as an institution needed to keep expanding lest it wither or die. Now, fascinating stuff right here on page 2. Most of page 1 is rather unreadable, but what we can make out, some rather interesting quips and puns, and newspapers loved filling these up. Sometimes jokes, sometimes complete fabrications. It's always sometimes hard to tell with these newspapers, but we have a couple here back to back. One of the 69th relates a funny story of an Irishman captured by them from the secessionists. After being brought into camp, his fellow countrymen taunted him with being a rebel. He took it quietly for a while, but at length warming up, saying, "Well, you're right, but I haven't had enough of fighting, and if any of ye here, friend or enemy, will indulge me, just throw down your gun and let us have it out with our fists." He was spoken of as a tall, powerful man, and was no doubt an acquisition to the South. Amusing, to be sure. Now, interestingly, this would be the 69th New York State Militia, as the famous 1st Regiment of the Irish Brigade, the 69th New York Volunteer Infantry, did not exist yet. When the 69th New York Militia's term of service ended after 90 days, they were returned to New York State and formed the core of the new Irish Brigade that was being created. Perhaps most famously, though, before this happened, the 69th Militia served with notable distinction at Bull Run, as they formed part of the U.S. Army rear guard that helped to protect the retreat from Manassas. They fought alongside another New York unit, the Fire Zouaves, the 11th New York, which was Colonel Ellsworth's unit. So New York performs quite admirably towards the end of that battle in protecting the retreating army as it goes by. But here we have a captured Southern Irishman being taunted by his New Yorkers in the 69th. And also here, a nautical pun. A returned soldier says that the defeat at Manassas was a stern lesson. We trust our soldiers will receive no more such, and they should remember that the only way to avoid them is to not turn their sterns to the enemy hereafter. Why I say it's a nautical pun, the stern of a ship is the rear, so yes, the only way to avoid a stern lesson, keep your stern pointed away from the enemy. That's so bad. A local bit of history here. We have an insane man attracted some attention in Troy on Tuesday last by his claims to be a prophet direct from God. He said the North was to blame for the present war, and that it would certainly be beaten in the present contest. This was a direct revelation, he claimed, from heaven. Well, given how the war turned out, I would say that this man's prophecies are about as useful as Confederate money. Now, speaking of the war, there's not a lot that's happening of note on the front, but the paper does make mention of some rebel cavalry that was surprised and captured in a minor skirmish near Sandy Hook, Maryland, on August 5th. So Sandy Hook is near Harper's Ferry, and in August of 1861 was the headquarters for Major General Nathaniel P. Banks, who was commanding the Department of the Shenandoah after Patterson was mustered out following the defeat at Bull Run. Patterson, you'll remember, was given command of the Department of the Shenandoah and was supposed to keep Johnson in the valley and utterly failed, as Johnston manages to slip over the mountains, join up with Beauregard, and then defeat McDowell at Manassas. So they sort of quietly muster him out, and his department is turned over to Nathaniel Banks, who is beginning to organize, because in 62 there will be an aggressive campaign in the valley one that will see 3 separate Union armies fail to coordinate and be singularly driven off by Stonewall Jackson in an impressive and exhausting feat of military ability. But we're still a ways away from that at this point. Right now, we just have some local skirmishing, few cavalrymen. They say there were 3 killed, 5 wounded, and 7 all taken prisoners, as well as horses, and recovered back across their river without loss. It seems they caught the cavalrymen while they were in a temporary camp. So, not a lot going on there. But there is the question of, what is an ambulance? An ambulance is a light carriage, the body mounted upon 2 wheels and supported by very elastic light springs. It is a little over 6 feet in length. There are cots for 2 inside, with beds, head pillows, etc. The top is covered with black oilcloth, but the body and running gear are painted red. The ambulance is intended for 1 horse, with a seat for the driver in front, and being very light, though strongly built, can be driven along very rapidly without injury to the wounded. So medical care for the wounded is a major field of Civil War historical research, and other people have covered this far better than I ever could in the time here. I do encourage you to check out the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. They are quite impressive and have a ton of resources available for those interested in this topic. They have a Facebook page, web page. They're on Twitter, Instagram. They're very easy to find, and they post very regularly. It's well worth a like and a follow for them. They are an amazing resource, and a number of the things I have here also are attributed to them, so thank you. What I can say at this point is 1861, the medical care provided by both armies is practically non-existent. These armies were far larger than any fielded in North America before, and the U.S. did not keep a regular standing army aside from a few small regiments scattered to protect the frontier and certain port cities. It's woefully unprepared for the scale of casualties produced by the war. And in 61, it struggled to properly triage, let alone even retrieve, the wounded. There's accounts of U.S. wounded at Bull Run being left on the field for days after the battle in the hot July sun without any care whatsoever. Now, the major change comes in 1862 with the appointment of Major Jonathan Letterman as medical director of the Army of the Potomac, the principal field army in the Eastern Theater. He quickly gets things organized and starts implementing a proper medical corps of ambulances and stretcher bearers. Actually, we have here, this is a photograph from an ambulance that was taken during the war. It gives you an idea of the type of structure we're talking about here. There were different variations in designs, of course, but the goal was to get these into the hands of corps and divisions so that infantry units could have them. Because part of the problem is that prior to his appointment, the ambulance is an optional support vehicle, and even then it's located with the artillery. So cavalry and infantry branches don't even really have access to ambulances. That needed to change. What Letterman does is he puts together an actual medical corps of ambulances, drivers, and stretcher bearers who would be responsible for retrieving wounded soldiers and then getting them to places where they could be properly triaged. Now, the major test of his system and his reforms comes in September of 62, when Lee fights McClellan at Antietam. And although it's far from perfect, Letterman's reforms allow the United States to save quite a few lives among the wounded on that field. And they prove so useful in getting people properly taken to field hospitals, getting them triaged, getting them assessed for care, that by executive order, his model is adopted by all U.S. field armies in 1862. It's really quite something. Although it would still take a few more years and a bit of work from Congress to actually get all of these things up to speed, by the end of the war, there's a proper medical department operating within the Army that is taking care of U.S. soldiers. Because that is not the case in 61. And it takes quite a bit of work. And part of that is this example here, literally having to talk about, well, what is an ambulance? Yes. Now, turning to a bit of local history, there was a devastating fire that actually swept through Schenectady in 1861. It was a couple days before this paper came out. Destructive fire, 20 buildings and one church burned, loss from $75,000 to $100,000. The most destructive fire that has occurred in this city in many years took place on Tuesday afternoon. The fire, when first discovered, was in the straw and manure heap in the rear of Otis Smith's broom shop, which soon communicated to that building, and from that to the dwellings on the west side of the Washington Street, and so across onto Front Street, sweeping all before it. The west wind was blowing strong at the time, and the whole force of the flames were directed towards the most populous part of the city, and threatened its entire destruction. In this dilemma, the mayor and recorder promptly telegraphed to Albany, Troy, and Amsterdam for assistance, and each of the three places responded to the call with an alacrity and will that was as gratifying as their assistance was beneficial. Albany came up with 3 engines, Troy with 2, one a steamer, and Amsterdam sent 2 companies whose assistance did much in checking the devouring element. The high wind threw the burning cinders and shingles over nearly one half the city, and they kindled in many places remote from where it originated, but fortunately was subdued by the care and watchfulness of the citizens. A burning mass struck upon the roof of the first Dutch church and soon kindled it to a blaze. Despite the exertions of our gallant firemen, the fine edifice and a dwelling adjoining, occupied by Mrs. Rogers, was burned to the ground. The loss on the church property is about $25,000. Insurance, $6,750. The loss of Mrs. Rogers cannot be less than $2,000. Fortunately, about 3 o'clock the wind lulled, and the further spread of the fire was checked and confined to the dwellings on Washington Street. On the west side, some 10 or 12 families were rendered homeless and their effects nearly destroyed. A block of brick buildings owned by G.W. Veeder and occupied by Messrs. Stanton, Angle, and Shaw were completely demolished, as also the building occupied by Mr. J.S.M. Marhyde. On the opposite side of the buildings were saved. Let me start that again. On the opposite side, the buildings were saved, those near the corner of Front Street in a damaged condition. The dwellings in the northeast corner of Front Street and towards the river on Washington Street, down to the building of Mr. Hearsay, were totally destroyed on both sides, and the occupants lost the most of their furniture. In this locality, Mr. G.W. Veeder losses several buildings also. The loss of Mr. Veeder will amount to $15,000 or $20,000 with no insurance. The large broom factory of Mr. Otis Smith and dwellings adjoining were also entirely consumed. Mr. Smith's loss will not fall short of $22,000 to $25,000. On Front Street, east of the corner, 3 small wood dwellings were burned, the occupants of which saved the most of their furniture. It was fortunate through all the excitement and alarm of the occasion that no loss of life occurred, but few slight personal injuries were sustained. So there is actually a painting of this. There we go. There it is. That is the Dutch Reformed Church on fire. And you have the neighboring house here. We can only assume that this might be Mrs. Rogers calling out for help. And what you have in the foreground, which I actually think is quite fascinating, is one of these fire engines. And I want to talk about this for just a minute because this is a really fascinating moment. So in the 19th century, fires were a serious threat to a city. Lack of proper building codes and large concentrations of wooden, flammable structures meant that when fire struck a city, it could do devastating damage. Shortly after the secession convention in Charleston, South Carolina, voted to secede, a significant chunk of the city burned to the ground, which caused all sorts of conspiracy theories to pop up that abolitionist agitators had come down and burned it, to northern newspapers that sort of joked and were like, well, it seems like that was a divine intervention, right? These secessionists are trying to destroy the country, so God destroyed their city. But the city's torched, and despite the provisional Confederate government allocating money for it being rebuilt, the reality of the situation is that the city is in ruins for most of the war. And it won't be till afterwards that you can begin a proper rebuilding of Charleston. There's photographs of it, and it's chilling because it looks like Atlanta or Richmond, parts of Richmond which are destroyed. And you might be forgiven for thinking that, oh, this was a casualty of war, right? This city. No, it's destroyed in December of 1860. But there you go. I actually came across one of these pictures. I had curated an exhibit, Images of Ruin, which we were looking at photographs that had been taken during the Civil War of property damage. And so I was familiar with some of these. And I went down to Georgia, visiting friends. And while there, I went to the Terra Museum, where they have a thing about the creation of Gone with the Wind. And when I walked in, I see one of the photographs on the wall, and the caption says, this is destroyed Atlanta. No, it isn't. It's Charleston. I can tell you exactly where in Charleston it is. I could tell you the street it was. And so I was that person, but I had a little conversation with the people on staff, and I was like, it's fine if you want a picture of Atlanta. That is not Atlanta. So there you go. A decade later, perhaps more famously, a great fire will utterly level Chicago, killing 300 people and destroying some 3 square miles of property. Fire in the 19th century? Deadly. Incredibly dangerous. Now, thankfully, that same fate did not befall Schenectady. But Schenectady was no stranger to flames. In 1690, Huron and French allies burned the city down as part of King William's War. Then again, in 1819, a fire will devastate the city, leaving some 200 people homeless. Now, fighting the fire in the 19th century is a frustrating affair. Fire engines, as we think of them, do not exist. What we did have, and is pictured here, which I kind of love that they've included this, was what was called a forcing pump. It's basically a cannon on wheels, but for water. All hand operated, no horse-drawn apparatus. Reason being, animals are expensive and costly to maintain, and they need to be cared for. Volunteer fire departments did not have the time or the resources or the men to properly care for a stable of horses to pull their vehicles around. So this pump, which was originally purchased in 1819 after the city had had its fire, required manual refilling. So firemen would literally have to go to the cisterns, get a bucket of water, bring it to the pump, and they would fill it, and then you could pump it. Fortunately, in the 1830s, Schenectady had modified the pump to allow it to use hoses. And the hoses would draw water from cisterns and wells, which had been placed strategically throughout the city. But it still required men to manually pump the handles, which was an exhausting task necessary to build up sufficient pressure to not only suction water out of the cisterns, but then provide the spray to combat the fire. Private citizens and other volunteers would still have used wooden and leather buckets to fight the fire as part of a bucket brigade directly, but also indirectly throughout the city, doing preventative work by soaking the roofs of houses on adjoining streets. The goal being to limit the spread of the fire, because burning embers can travel a considerable distance and still be hot enough to start a fire. You might not be on the street where the fire is, but you can bet that you're getting up when those bells start to go off, and you're going to be throwing buckets of water on your roof and on your lawn, because you need those embers to come, sizzle, and die. Firefighting truly was a full community affair. Now, Troy's pump, which the column had mentioned, was apparently quite something. It was steam-powered. Apparently, though, it was also a little bit too powerful, as some local histories have attested that when it was properly steamed up and pressurized, the force of the water would actually punch holes in walls when it was pointed at buildings, which I guess that is one way of fighting the fire, I suppose. The loss to the city was hard. An estimate that would be today the equivalent of about $3 million in property damage. And amazingly, no one died. That is quite impressive. There were a few injuries, but no fatalities. As for the Dutch Reformed Church, it would go on to be rebuilt. There are accounts of private citizens trying to save effects from inside. One of the things that the church was famous for was a massive bell, some 3,000 pounds, that had replaced an older bell which had cracked around 1848. So this bell is barely like 12, 13 years old. And as the fire rages, the bell tower collapses, and according to one newspaper report, it makes more noise during its collapse out of the tower than it ever made in its 13 years in the steeple, which is just, that's sad. Allegedly, though, the head of the local church was not too upset. Apparently, he'd been clamoring for years to update it and modify it, and nothing like a cleansing fire to give you the chance to start over, I guess. And it is rebuilt, and it's still there today, in fact. But it does suffer another fire, this time in 1948. So when you see it today on, you guessed it, Church Street, you're actually looking at the 6th version that has stood on or about that location. That church has been built and rebuilt several times. Now, a lot of the work that I just talked to you about was done by volunteers at the Schenectady County Historical Society, and I cannot go on without acknowledging the incredible detective work they did poring over old newspapers and diaries and compiling a lot of this information. And so thank you to them for that. I'm so grateful for the work they did to fill in the gaps in this history. Truly, check out your local historical societies. They have some incredible resources, and they do good work. You really can find some amazing things there. And so I'm so happy to be able to tell this story, and that it showed up here in this paper. I assumed it would have to wait another week, but they got it to press just 2 days after it happened. Now, I would like to turn to a piece here on what the war is for, because it's one of the biggest issues right now with Civil War scholarship is that there is a subset of the populace that just does not want to hear it. They don't want to talk about what the Civil War was about because they have it made up in their own minds. And it is some combination of constitutional principles and states' rights. They don't want to acknowledge the role that slavery plays in tearing the nation apart because it's messy, it's racial, and it's not what they were told. Well, I hate to break it to you, as early as 1861, people understood what the war was about, even though emancipation is not an explicit war aim of the Lincoln administration. And in fact, he will do a number of things early on in the war that will frustrate abolitionist-minded allies, such as chastising people like David Hunter or Fremont, who issue sweeping unconstitutional emancipation orders within their jurisdictions, basically freeing any slaves who happen to be within their districts, even those from loyal Americans. That is a seizure of private property. Lincoln is very much concerned with that, and as a result, he rebukes a number of these orders and makes his officers stop confiscating property, and yes, this includes enslaved people, from loyal citizens. One, he's trying to avoid driving any more border states into the Confederacy, but two, the United States is a country of laws, and we do have due process. Slavery was a monstrous sin and should never have been permitted to exist as long as it did. But for all the other accusations that get leveled at Lincoln, he is not willing to use the powers of his office unjustly to end it. And people like to throw this around. They're like, well, the war wasn't about slavery because the U.S. didn't set out to end the slavery. True, they did not. The enslaved did. The enslaved knew from day one that this was about them, and they made the war about them. Confederates knew from day one that the war was about slavery, and they said so. Every chance they had, they brought it up. It's not till well after the war that they begin to rewrite this history, and then it is perpetuated by groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of Confederate Veterans, who then conveniently ignore everything going on before the war, ignore an enormous trove of primary sources during the war, and focus on a narrow sliver of revisionist documents that get created after the fact in order to claim that slavery was not the cause of the war, it had nothing to do with it, it was about this, that, or the other, but not slavery. Okay. Why am I giving you this? Because right here in 1861, we have them asking, what is the war for? Many who have exhibited rather an indifference as to what we are fighting for now begin to ask this question. It has generally been supposed that it was to put down rebellion and enforce the laws, but it would seem from the following extract from the New York Times, an administration organ, that this is not the whole object of the war. The freedom of the Negro is at the bottom of it. And the Times says, if our army had been victorious at Manassas, they would have marched on to Richmond and ended this war upon a false basis, both parties ignoring to the last the cause of the war. The God that rules over all and does exact justice in the end to bond and free would not permit a compromise of this sort to forestall his providence, and he has awakened the nation as by the shock of an earthquake. Would anything short of our unexpected repulse at Manassas have quickened the conscience and judgment of 20 millions of people in regard to this conflict? The ghost of long murdered liberty to millions of weak and despairing captives leaves its tombs and haunts our army and frights it to panic and flight. Now shall we learn anew and rightly our position and duties. We have an enemy to meet who has long defied God and man, who has for generations outraged justice and humanity, and who threatens to extend over a whole continent the diabolism of his rule. Shall we strike the monster where he is invulnerable? Shall we thrust in our spear where the cancer of his crime invites to surgery? Shall we fight the devil with fire, according to the wisdom of the ancients? Let a paralyzed army and reeling nation answer. If this is not a declaration that we are fighting to abolish slavery, then we do not understand the meaning of words. One of the best things the Confederacy ever did was survive long enough to persuade enough of the northern population that it was not simply enough to end the war, that the root cause that had torn at the national fabric for decades, slavery, needed to go. By winning a few crucial battles early, the Confederacy endured, and as such, forced the North to reevaluate its principles, to reevaluate its purpose. Lincoln was fully prepared to reunify the country and leave slavery intact. He detested it, personally, the institution, but he also did not have a roadmap for ending it. He did not see a constitutional way to do it. The president did not have such powers. But as the war goes on, and the northern populace resolves to end it, and U.S. armies push deeper and deeper into the South, and Northerners begin to come face to face with slavery for the first time, soldiers' letters and diaries bear out that lots of people who had been indifferent to the plight of African Americans suddenly felt their hearts churning. They saw slavery for what it was, the inhumanity, the barbarism. They saw the whips, they saw the scars, they saw the severed limbs. They fought side by side, albeit in segregated units, with African Americans. And while this did not provoke a racial utopia, it did convince people that the war needed to change. The goals of the war needed to change. That what needed to be preserved needed to be better. I think it's worth pointing out that when Lincoln runs for re-election in 1964, his platform includes a promise that they will not stop until the South is utterly defeated and returned to the country, and the promise for a constitutional amendment to forever end slavery. He gets a vast majority of the soldier vote. The first time in our national history that we use absentee ballots to allow soldiers to vote while on active duty. They're voting to stay at war. They're voting to continue the fight until it's over. Now, his opponent is George McClellan, a favorite of the Army in the Eastern Theater because he had been a very capable administrator who was not careless with his soldiers' lives, and turns the Army of the Potomac from a defeated force into a model of military efficiency. An incredible administrator, not a great battlefield commander, although he does get dumped on pretty hard. He's not as bad as popular histories want to make him out to be, but he certainly has his faults. He is the leading choice for the Democrats, and although he refuses to endorse it personally, the party has a pledge to end the war with a negotiated peace. Enough is enough. Soldiers could have voted to go home. We've fought and we've died. Enough is enough. And they vote to stay. Is it because they all had a racial awakening? Of course not. Of course not. And we can't know for sure how many of them did vote for Lincoln because they were ardent Republicans and embraced the new party, or because they wanted to see slavery abolished. But at the end of the day, his platform did include that promise, and he gets a massive amount of the soldiers' vote. What is this war about? Well, you already have newspapers here talking about it. There's jokes in this newspaper about it already. A young lady was sitting at a window in Camden, New Jersey a few days ago when she observed a colored girl, pardon the dated parlance here, cutting up some antics, and she commented laughing. The girl observed it, turned up her nose, and said, "You white girl needn't laugh. You've got no boys now. They're all gone south to fight for us. African Americans knew this was their great moment. They knew this was their chance to finally force slavery from being an issue that bothered abolitionists to being an issue that bothered the country. And they seized on it. They ran away whenever the army was close. They agitated. People like Frederick Douglass used their fame in order to petition governors, the president, give black men the rifle, give black men the uniform. Military service has always been closely linked to citizenship in this country, and people like Frederick Douglass knew that. Let black soldiers fight, because they couldn't. By law, only white men could serve in the army. The American Revolution had integrated units, and one of the first things the new government does is pass a militia law that specifically says only white men are allowed to serve. Because military service was tied to citizenship, and permitting black men to serve would create an uncomfortable path to legitimate citizenship for African Americans in a country that wasn't yet sure what it wanted to do with black people. At the start of the war, black men actually rushed to enlist for the U.S., and they're turned away because legally the government could not accept their service. And it's not until 1862, when the militia law is rewritten by Republicans in Congress, that they're able to begin putting together black units. And that's how we get to the 54th Massachusetts, the first all-black U.S. Army unit that will fight in the Civil War. This is 1861. They're already talking about it. There's another one here I rather enjoy. Perhaps I can... Oh, shoot. Is it not on this page? Washington's letter. Ohio editor. I was positive it was here. Congress adjourned. Modest request. Huh. There was a piece here on how do we know that this is an abolition war, and that it basically was as obvious as a drunk man washing his face in a puddle. I don't have to tell you that he's drunk. All I'm going to tell you is that he washed his face and his beard in a puddle in the street, right? It's obvious if you look at him. Must be on a different page. I was positive it was page 2. Let me take a quick look again at page 1. There's the 69th New York, the insane man from Troy. Okay, nope, it's not there. So it must be on this page. My eyes are searching. I should just edit all this out when I'm done, because I can't seem to locate it. What is the war for? There it is. Good heavens, that took way too much work. It was on the page with me the entire time. Yeah, I'm definitely going to edit that out. Or maybe I won't. We'll see. Our Republican Exchange wants to know what evidence the Democratic press has that this is an abolition war. Well, we have as good evidence as the witness had that the man was drunk who washed his face in a mud puddle. I didn't say, Your Honor, that the man was intoxicated. No, not by any means. But this I will say, when last I saw him, he was washing his face in a mud puddle and drying it on a doormat. All right, I'm not saying he was drunk, but come on. It's pretty obvious. What evidence is that this is an abolition war? It's pretty obvious. And that tension will be at the heart of the prospect going forward. What is the war ultimately about? What is the point of preserving the Union if you leave slavery intact? How do you go about ending slavery in a country where so many people are willing to fight to keep it. August 8th, 1861. The Schenectady Democrat and Reflector continues to have fascinating articles. There's pieces here attacking Lincolnism, radical abolitionists from the North, calling them professional agitators. If you go all the way back to the American Revolution, you can find newspapers complaining about paid protesters. Maybe they don't use that exact phrase, but they are talking about it. Foreign agents who are sent in to stir up trouble, right? There aren't actual problems here in Boston. It's the result of foreign agitators, paid demonstrators, what we might nowadays call crisis actors. This is an old line in American history. It goes all the way back to the founding. When Shays' Rebellion is taking place in Massachusetts, you can have people in the Massachusetts legislature who are accusing the British. It's not that our veterans are upset or that they're improperly taxed or that they're having problems and they're indebted. No, this is the result of foreign agents who have come in to stir up trouble, and they're agitating people. They're paying people to protest and riot. It's a classic line. Yeah. Continues to be a fascinating paper, but loved the look at the politics of the Confederacy, and I loved the attention to the local fire in Schenectady because that was a doozy, and helped shape what downtown in the Stockades looks like today, because it certainly cleared out quite a bit of territory. This has been the Civil War on Paper, Episode 3. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please remember to like and subscribe so you can be notified each week when these are posted. Have a great night.